Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me, and happy Sunday to all of you. Hello, everybody. Hello, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here. Hello, everybody. Everybody. Everybody, everybody, everybody. Can we hear ourselves? Can we hear me? Let me know. 3 minutes late. Brilliant. So, I noticed a couple of questions left upstairs, which I'm going to take. Let's ground ourselves a bit first, in the war sense and in the democracy at home sense. Before that, there's a question I could just take very quickly from SASSB. What is your perspective on the recent Russian anti-trans bill, and what might this teach us about the root causes of similar Western policies? Not much. So I'm looking forward to talking about trans rights and trans experience, and also trans discourse in the West. I don't think that except in some very general sense, the sources are the same between what's happening here and what's happening in Russia. What I do think is that trans folks and indeed gay folks in Russia might be the first group to be on the wrong end of the experience of categorical repression. That is to say, repression by category. That is quite different to the pointillistic authoritarianism, or even the pointillistic totalitarianism that we've often seen, right? You're picking up not the whole group, but a couple here, a couple there, and leaving most to get on with their lives. Obviously, there is no limit to how far the regime can go in gross exploitation of an issue at the expense of the safety and really the lives of a small minority. There's just no doubt that there's no limit to how far they're going to go. But my prediction is that this categorical repression, which has been completely absent really from the pre-war Russia, will increase. And what we get now with trans folks, that's going to expand to other groups. To make the connection with the West, I would need to say quite a bit more about the West too, and I will do that with pleasure another time. Let's ground ourselves first a bit. War-wise, we're basically waiting for what happens over the next 2 months, or maybe a bit more. And that doesn't mean things won't move, right? Major powers in the world are talking between themselves and within themselves about what their position will be if Ukraine does not make significant progress with its offensive, with its counteroffensive, whatever we're calling it now. So there's a movement toward having a ready-made position for that scenario, which is the preponderant scenario that is expected by everybody, from China to India to the United States. The preponderant scenario that's expected is that Ukraine will not make as much progress as we would like. Now, some of these actors will be very unhappy if Ukraine makes more progress. Many Western actors will be happy potentially if Ukraine makes more progress and is commensurate with the amount of help Ukraine has got. But again, you've got to be careful here because this is war. And also, Ukraine is fighting a very special kind of state. It's fighting a kind of imploding empire. So exponentially catastrophic events on the Russian side are possible. And a Ukrainian victory, therefore, is possible, even if it doesn't look immediately likely. Let me read you a tweet that I wrote today, um, because it speaks to the heart of why we're here at all. Um, and I'll read the tweet I wrote before that too, because it connected. And what I said was that thinking for ourselves is hard, and thinking for ourselves doesn't mean being right or being original, but it means having the courage to swim in shark-infested waters. And we should demand this from our intellectual heroes, right? And I said some of the intellectual heroes in our culture need to receive not guru status, but a hug. They pretend to swim in shark-infested waters, but in reality paddle in the pool with arm floaties attached. So we've got a crisis of many intellectual figures of authority in our culture being the baby in the pool with ducks, with water wings. And my reaction to them is not to say, oh, you're disgraceful and you're appalling and you're spreading disinformation. Just want to give them a hug. That's important too, because we're all sharing a society. And the tweet that followed is the one I really want to share. The alternative view culture has died. This is the culture that says the establishment has got it wrong. We need a separate, independent conversation. That culture is dead. It has become not a culture, but a pathology of entrepreneurial opinion surfing. But the reasons for its existence still remain. The mainstream, too, has lost credibility and trust. And people are scared and caught in the middle. Okay, that's enough of that. A quick footnote before we move on. People are scared sometimes because they agree or they find intelligible and adequate the establishment perspective. Whatever you might be talking about, I'm not talking about anything in particular here. I'm talking about the establishment perspective on how democracy works. I'm talking about the establishment perspective on how public health works, on how foreign policy works. The establishment perspective. I'm deliberately being vague. Many people feel the establishment perspective is right, but are terrified because they do not understand why it's being so deeply questioned. Right? But then there are many people who feel that the establishment perspective, um, and so for these first people who agree with the establishment perspective, it's terrifying because something that should be basic is everywhere being questioned. What is going on and how could this be? And what kind of world are we living in? Right? So that's terrifying. But then there are the people who have rejected the alternative view, right? The anti-establishment alternative view. But they're suspicious of the establishment view too. They think it's not credible anymore. They think the crisis of trust isn't an accident, right? They think there's a real reason for it. But they don't know exactly what it is, but they know it's there. And they can see through the BS of many of the alternative views, but they can see through the BS of the establishment and they see nothing. Doesn't mean there isn't anything, but they see nothing in between. And that is absolutely terrifying because there's a sense of there being nowhere to turn to, which is a place that will narrate the experience you're having, the experience you're seeing. So that is why we've got to be so intentional about how we think about the conversations that we're having. Not just what we say, but formats in which we say it, and procedures and rituals with which we say it. And actually the um, emotion with which we say it, and the sense of responsibility of us in saying it, particularly tied to the issue of how it will enter the wider economy of discourse, right? that you feel responsible about what you're adding, not just in the sense of, well, I've thought about it and now I think it's a good thing to say, but in the sense that, well, I've seen what the economy of discourse is out there, what it's like, and what would be a healthy thing to inject into it. And is it got a terrible deficiency of vegetables, or is it got a terrible deficiency of salt? What do we got to add, right, responsibly? So, um, very, very quickly, a couple of questions on Iran. In terms of how much Russia might help with the Iranian nuclear program, that's not my expertise. What I would say is there's a series of gradations, however, right? A series of less and more direct steps of help. And we got to sort of understand what they are and then explore how likely each one is. And that's a little bit outside my expertise. Michael is saying that Mr. Peskov has said to the New York Times, our presidential election is not really democracy, it is costly bureaucracy. Mr. Putin will be re-elected next year with more than 90% of the vote. I don't think Mr. Peskov could have said that seriously. In other words, I'm sure he said that, but I don't think he could have said that seriously. Partly because he still needs to say it's a democracy, and partly because it's not 90%, it's 70. So my sense of that is that he is trolling the person interviewing him. It's inconceivable for him to say that with a completely straight face. So that's what I say about that. What's your take on ban the Quran stuff? Ban burning of the Quran stuff. We will talk about what is Islamophobia and what is not Islamophobia. And we will also talk about free speech another time. This is a delicate conversation. What I would say is that because of the distinction in the West between the secular and the religious sphere, we tend to not understand cultures which do not have this distinction, right? And the trouble is in the West, there are subcultures that do not quite hold that distinction the way that we do. And that leads to a certain kind of a lack of understanding. We'll talk about it. But I'm somebody who does believe there's a lot of Islamophobia. But that doesn't tell you what my views about free speech are. Could you define fascism as your next question? No, because I've done it a few times already, and it would take about 5 minutes to put a cartoon on the table. So let me just say that there are two ways of defining fascism. One is what I call the serious way, and that could be either historical or politically philosophical. And then there is the everyday. So there is a debate that people have. Can you have an everyday definition of fascism that is used in daily politics, right? That we could all use as we sort of scroll through the comment section, go back and forth with each other. And I believe that we need that. The reason I believe that we need that is because people are not going to stop using the word fascism. So that's why I believe we need two brackets of definition of fascism, something that is more adequate to the complexity of the world and more academically and historically reflectively supportable, and something that is simpler and can be thrown about like a ball in political discourse, right? And here there could be a distinction based on very sort of simple images, like are they coming for me in the middle of the night? If they are, fascism. If they're not, not fascism, right? So that needs to be brought out. If you're invited on a Joe Rogan podcast, what would be the main points you would want to get across to him and his audience? How would it differ from what you tell us? I'm open to going on everywhere with some limitations. One limitation would obviously be a place where violence is threatened. Another limitation would be where there is a level of entrepreneurial engagement that means that sharing a view there is just unproductive. It's not gonna help anyone. And then above all, I don't participate really, except, I mean, there's always going to be an exception, but I don't participate in debates. I don't think debates are conducive to conversation. I think conversations are sterile, in which it's the task of all parties to win an argument. Um, but what I probably would be talking about on that podcast would be just what I said earlier, how there is an undeniable collapse of trust in mainstream discourse and in public institutions, but how attempts to replace it have also catastrophically failed, right? And that would clearly be one of the topics. So let's go. We're going to be about 45 minutes today only. So let's do another half hour. I'm going to get ready to answer some of your questions. Let us have a look. Let us have a look. Cenk is saying all of Putin's goals are yet to be achieved about a year and a half later. So I don't think that in itself necessarily quite captures what we're looking at. What we're looking at essentially is an attempt to change the world order, in which Ukraine has some significance, but very little. Ukraine is sort of factor number 7 in Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Putin wanted to radically reshake the international scene, and that has completely failed so far. Now, that is why it's quite meaningless relative to that central aspiration to talk about how much of Ukraine Putin is managing to keep and for how long. That these are not the goal. These are not the goals. Even taking Kiev was not the goal. The goal was a radical reshaping of the international order, a near dissolution of NATO, and a massive increase in Putin's capacity to conceive of and get away with conceiving of Eastern Europe in a proprietorial way. So he wants to come back to that and try that again. 100 kilometers one way, 100 kilometers another is neither here nor there relative to that end, right? Obviously, if Putin loses Crimea, you could say it's kind of game over. He would say, if he's lost Crimea and kept power, no, we'll try to get it back and then some. But, nothing that happens in Ukraine, even taking all of Ukraine, is necessarily constitutive of the kind of result that Putin was after. Maybe taking all of Ukraine would get him much closer to it. But this war is not about Ukraine. It's worth emphasizing that. But indeed, you're right, literally speaking, that Putin's project is not going well a year and a half in. Does Putin benefit in any way from Prigozhin's engagement in the coup in Nigeria and from the weakening democracy there? It's a good question whether Putin benefits from anything Prigozhin does. And so I would separate various activities that Prigozhin Wagner might engage with, and the question of whether it should be Prigozhin engaging in these activities. And the problem with decoupling the two is that some of these things that only Prigozhin can do, and then it's also true that Putin is struggling, or would struggle to completely asphyxiate Prigozhin for now. So I would say that as far as the internal politics of it goes, the key issue for Putin is basically not what should be done, but whether it's Prigozhin doing it or not, right? And how far Prigozhin still doing quite a few things poses a threat to him. Um, and that's why we should still not be surprised, right, despite all of the hunky-dory stuff we've seen, if Putin were contemplating to eliminate Prigozhin, physically eliminate Prigozhin, but waiting for a more congenial moment, um, waiting for a more congenial moment to do that. I wouldn't rule that out. Um, but what I think globally is worth saying, it's too early to draw lessons from the Prigozhin mutiny. Probably if we let a couple of more weeks, a month pass, we could orientate ourselves a bit better. But it's still too early to draw lessons about winners and losers, except just in the sense that Mr. Putin has lost at the level of this business of perceived legitimacy. Christopher is wishing me well. Thank you so much. Dave, thank you so much. RS, thank you so much. Mhm. People are outraged about Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. How does the world deal with another Trump presidency? I mean, one thing that I'm very passionate about um, is to cast Trump in the light of a um, um, global democratic slide backwards. Um, in my cup is an um, o- oat milk um, turmeric latte. Um, that's very important to see a global pattern here. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't produce an entirely US analysis of what to make of Trump and also what his chances of winning the next election are, which are very high. Um, but the point is, you cannot understand domestic backsliding. Um, you can't understand domestic backsliding democratically without understanding the global pattern. You cannot understand Brexit independently of Trump, for example, right? So you gotta see some important patterns, as well as, of course, genuinely and deeply analyzing the domestic context. That makes a huge amount of difference, right? Of course, there are going to be 3 or 4 central factors that are unique to the United States that inform how we judge Trump's odds. You know, Kristen is asking what type of philosophy do you do? Um, so I've got a health condition, which means that I work very few hours a day, about 3, on lucky days 4, and I'm doing very little of it. But I'm writing a book at snail space about the political concept of freedom. Um, so because of my health, what's happened basically is that I reversed the order. I began speaking to the culture first. And in some way, my academic contribution and my books will have to catch up with that. 20 years ago, just before I got sick, my expectation was I'd write one book of political philosophy, one book of moral philosophy, and then I would open up and begin speaking to the culture. Well, I'm 42 and the first book isn't done yet. Um, but I decided that it's easier to start the public conversation than wheel out one of the other projects first. But I am passionate about wheeling them out. And I don't believe, like some people do, that they can be the same thing. I think there are separate hats to wear, the public intellectual hat and the intellectual hat. I believe the public intellectual hat means you come first, not my views, not my arguments. You come first. The intellectual hat doesn't put anybody first except the um, culture and the analysis. Um, but what I believe is that I've got one out into the world. I'll get the second out if I'm lucky, not in sooner than 10 years from now. And if that happens, there'll be also a very wonderful way for them to bridge, because the academic staff will be a deeper reservoir you can dive into that will complement the public intellectual stuff. So that'll be extraordinary if I manage to sort of arrive there. I'll feel extremely blessed. But it's feeling nearly impossible to balance it all with the limited time I have. But I'm thrilled about the idea of trying in 17 different ways, and maybe one of them will get me there. And I think I'm also due a State of the Union conversation with all of you guys about where I think we're at so far on our journey of our community, our conversation, and where I think we're moving next to develop and to grow. And I'll have that with you soon. Hi, Carrie. Um, I have an ethical issue with playing the piano, but I don't have an ethical issue with demonstrating a few things on the piano. That might happen on the classical music channel. That's actually it's actually up on YouTube, but um, it 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 will have content on it soon. Um, Julia, yes, Rachel's got the mod tool, and my hope is to give it to half a dozen people who, if they happen to be around when I'm doing a live, can moderate it a bit. The downside of moderating is that maybe one should 30% sort of dial down strong expressions of one's own view when one does that, even if they accord with mine, just because I think that's important for the community. And so there's a kind of a compromise and downside to doing that. But I haven't got around to asking uh, people. So it's just Rachel is doing an incredible job. But I'd love there to be about half a dozen of us doing this. Um, and I'm also going to ask the community to create um, timestamps for lives, which I can't do at the moment until I get help. Funnily enough, it's so weird with my health condition. I did timestamps once for a live I did, and doing the stamps was 3 times harder than just doing the live itself, just because of the brain inflammation I have and how it affects certain activities more than others. Um, so that's my thinking on that. Um, Tubal Kane is saying Karim Mirza compared his case to show trials in the Stalin era. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna get more and more Stalinist sentences in length in Russia, unfortunately, and the country will drift closer toward terror. The Putin state can go on with the war for a long time, but if it has to go on for for a very long time, it it has to become much more repressive than it is today, in my opinion. French, um, thank you, and hi, Kari. Did I say thank you? I just acknowledged you without saying thank you, so thank you. French, don't you think magical thinking about the market led to yes, to an economic catastrophe in Russia in the 1990s? I also think the Russian constitution, being a semi-presidential system, paved the way for Putin institution. Sure, yeah. So um, Russia, in a teacherly way, got offered a kind of ideological fantasy instead of a reform program. It's also complex. I mean, there were many forces in the West that didn't want Russia to flourish, um, and what happened was that this sort of highly ideologically bizarre view of the market that got recommended to Russia in a teacherly way came alongside with a highly strange view of democracy too. Um, democracy stripped from civic virtues and tied to just not much more than elections. And Greg Uden, a few days ago, put it in a very helpful way, in a way that captured the um, lack of political agency that is a crisis everywhere, of course, but it's a major, almost unparalleled crisis on Russian territory. And Greg said, "Oh, you want us to do this sort of quasi neoliberal thing? We'll do it. You want us to do the democracy thing you've recommended? Oh, we'll do that too." And now you're seeing that we've got elections, but no other evidence of democracy, and even those are going to fail eventually, of course, because there's nothing else around them, no democratic processes and rituals around them that are adequate. And you ask us to do the capitalism with this ideological lens, this ideological twang that happened to be very popular at the time. You asked us to do that. We did it. We did it. Look at the results. We did what you asked us, and look at how it turned out. So you got what you asked for. You know? And then you are seeing a society without any safety nets. You're seeing a society without any um, interest in the cultivation of solidarity, um, the sort of emaciated solidarity that was still available in the 80s at the end of the catastrophic communist experiment. That got killed off too. So there's a kind of a sort of a rebellious compliance. I've just paraphrased Greg with this little rant, but there's a kind of a rebellious compliance there. Um, that's worth noting. But yes, I think that if you want a very simple introduction to these policies, you could read John Gray's False Dawn, which John wrote at the end of the 90s, but it's got a very good chapter on this. It's highly accessible. Um, um, what would be the point of Peskov trolling? Well, Peskov might be trolling um, the journalist, trolling the journalists. I'm just seeing John Gray's name there. Trolling the journalists' perspective on Russia being a fake democracy. Well, you think we're a fake democracy, so yeah, we're going to get 90% for Mr. Putin. I think that's what's going on. If he said that in all seriousness, then some kind of switch is broken in him. Um, But Mr. Peskov does not look like somebody who breaks like Mr. Medvedev breaks. DH is saying it's hard to find out how the war is going on the ground. I think it's important to be casual, and it's important to be slow, and it's important to pluralize, right? And it's important to follow good military experts who have a track record of saying, well, this has gone worse than expected for Ukraine. This has gone better than expected for Ukraine, right? Obviously, you can't balance this by following pro-Russian sources because there aren't pro-Russian sources. Um, because you can't trust somebody who supports an outrageous imperialistic implosion. Um, but yeah, pluralize and go slow, and know this, that privately, right, a good number of people who vehemently support Ukraine are concerned about whether the pro-Ukrainian activism is harming Ukraine. There's a very widespread conversation behind the scenes, right? Um, that it does not help to say that Ukraine is at step 4 when it's at step 2. Um, I tend to be a little bit more slow to make definitive judgments about what's constructive and what's unconstructive discourse, because it needs to be part of the entire economy here, right? Um, Plus, there's a lot of people who are grifting pro-Ukraine, right? Then there are people who are just entrepreneurially grifting pro-Ukraine or half grifting. And I don't know how to criticize that. I don't think I can criticize that. Um, and then some of it might even be positive because it's onto the right cause. Some of it isn't. Um, so I'd just say be careful about the fact that these questions don't necessarily have clear answers, but they're worth raising, right? It's not, in other words, it's not obvious that saying, "Oh my God, another catastrophic collapse for Putin." It's not obvious that that helps Ukraine. That's something at least that we can debate. My guess would be that Ukraine's capacity for progress, whatever it is, with the counteroffensive, is probably underestimated in Moscow. That would be my guess. No, I'm not, Mark. I'm not participating in that panel, but I will put it on the community post in case some people want to see it, because there's going to be familiar faces there. People from this community will recognize. Victor is asking, the idea of trading Russia into a democracy failed. Could it have worked if there were greater cultural exchanges? Would a two-way cultural exchange help Russian democracy? Well, now, the Lviv panel, yeah. Now, no. Eventually, yes. Um, mm, what we have to understand is that what we've got is very little cultural exchange with Russia over the last 30 years. We got cultural exchange with a few individual Russians here and there, but a lot of the Russian elite, a lot of the pro-Putin Russian elite, who have um, impacted deleteriously our political processes, indeed. Right? So the West opened its door to that network that loosely put is the Putin regime, right? And allowed that network to seep out. And in a certain sense, take possession of our political processes and to some degree corrupt them too. That's happened. But there was no real major cultural exchange over the last 30 years. And the level of mobility within the Russian state, within Russia, is very low, very, very low indeed. Um, I mean, you might say it's not that great in the United States, but people move within the United States a lot. People do not move much within Russia. So, of course, it matters because you see what's possible. And Russians are suffering from a catastrophic collapse of their capacity for imagining an alternative future. Eisenier's Editions is asking, is Galeotti reliable? In my view, yes, very. What I think, one of the understated qualities that Mark has is his capacity to speculate responsibly. Because everybody is a victim of this situation where, especially when you do an interview, um, not always. I didn't do that well in it, but I did a beautiful interview from bed this morning on BBC Radio Wales. Beautiful questions. Um, but sometimes, interview questions are like, what do you think Prigozhin is having for breakfast today? And how will that affect the political situation in Belarus? And which African countries will be impacted by what Mr. Prigozhin ate? And then the answer is, well, what the hell are you? Yeah, nobody knows that, and how is that relevant? And Mark has a wonderful way of saying, okay, well, let's speculate a bit about that. I suppose he could have eaten this or he could have eaten that, but in the end, I'm not sure it's going to matter that much for what happens. So Mark has this fantastic capacity for responsible and informative educational speculation. And what he does when he does it, he helps us gear into the right weighing of something, right? So that's Mr. Galeotti. Thank you, Rachel. Dan is saying he doesn't believe in democracy. I don't believe in elephants or motor cars or oceans or skies because they're difficult to define. How do you define an elephant? Downstairs saying everybody knows breakfast was invented by the cereal companies. I often miss breakfast. Don't have breakfast. Dougie is saying that I lived in his Germany in the late 80s. Kristin, I would love to have a cup of tea with you in which you would successfully define what an elephant is. Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Google Day. Jan is saying, do you think studies of the Soviet man and the nature of the Soviet man contribute to decision understanding? I think that a lot of them at the moment are having a deleterious impact with certain caricatural and, quite frankly, um, racist categorizations of Russians by Russians that don't help explain what's really going on. So that might involve certain ideas about um, the basis of Putin or of the support for Mr. Putin that may mischaracterize what's really going on, which is a kind of special depoliticization that needs to be explained. It can't be explained in terms of all of these, polls that you get with 70% support. Pilgrim is talking about difficulties of Ukraine taking over certain territories like Crimea. Yeah, I mean, if Ukraine were given Crimea tomorrow, it would need to be an extraordinary um, in set of you know ongoing um, political endeavors to make Crimea feel appropriately part of Ukraine. But that's going too far ahead, right? It'd be good if Ukraine got Crimea. If it got it without World War III, especially. Ian. Ian is asking me a question. Vlad, this may be two-party political, but conservatives making climate change a political football. Bad? Obvious, I know, but it's a politics democracy question. I think that some of it is personal. So you have, Elizabeth, thank you so much. You have a prime minister in the UK who basically does not care about the issue of the climate crisis much, which is lower than a very low bar. And that's obviously disastrous. And it's beyond the issue of climate, it's an expression of the decline in quality in contemporary politics. The British Prime Minister is, let's not mess around. He's not a complete idiot. He's intelligent and competent to a certain level. I would be happy for him to be my accountant, possibly my cardiologist, maybe not. But we're not talking about prime minister material. We're talking about somebody who is not good enough to be in a cabinet of a government in previous years, let alone be the prime minister. And it's not just quality, it's that quality also encompasses irresponsibility. And Rishi Sunak is an irresponsible political actor. He is not a destructive exclusionary populist who wants to smash democratic processes. He's not one of those. He is an entrepreneurial politician, and he is interested in surfing the waves of Britain's political culture for self-advantage. And it's very important that that's not an ideological point. You do not have to be like that, whether you're centrist, left, right, green, hard right even. But that these are his qualities is not an accident. It is part of a general slide in quality that is connected to the crisis of trust we're experiencing. So what is profoundly wrong with Rishi's position on climate isn't what it is, but that he feels no sense of responsibility to engage with the biggest challenge we face, which is quite extraordinary, but not surprising. So that's what I would say. He feels like that about other things too. And of course, it is not possible to say, "Oh, we had a couple of bad ones, we'll have a better one later." No, this is an expression of a democratic slide, right? Rishi illustrates the state of British democracy. What I would say is that Britain's democratic institutions are extraordinarily strong. They're nearly the strongest in the world, which means that they can collapse. But it takes a lot of degradation for them to collapse, right? And we're not looking at a situation in which there is an opposition party that has answers to the questions that the government is catastrophically failing to reckon with adequately, right? And that's a big problem. Tim, Putin cannot count on Trump in 2024. Trump relies on pro-life voters. Pro-life voters will be able to vote for the pro-life American Solidarity in 2024. I don't know what you're talking, where you're going with this. If you think that Trump can't win, that's not my view. I think there's a coin toss predicament we're looking at there at the moment. It could evolve. Um, what Putin thinks about this isn't that one thing could happen or the other thing could happen. He thinks that even if Trump loses, um, American democracy will continue declining because its decline is inevitable. And that is different to the view that I have about the state of Western democracy. I believe Western democracy is in decline, but I believe that decline is slow. I believe there is institutional depth that will give us a lot of time to resist. I believe that there are mechanisms for democratic regeneration potentially available. They're all really hard to reach for, but they're possible. They're there, right? Whereas Mr. Putin sees our decline as a kind of a dogma, as something that is inexorable, right? So he is not sitting there thinking, oh, I hope this and that goes my way. He's sitting there thinking, there is this inexorable pattern. It may be realized sooner or later. I hope it gets realized sooner. So there is a kind of a almost transcendental quality to his belief in our decline. Um, and that is empirically insupportable, luckily for us. Papa is saying something about my health condition, myalgic encephalomyelitis. Yes, we've understood for 30 years that myalgic encephalomyelitis is a systemic um, neuroimmune disorder. Daggy, democracy can tolerate a lot of tribalism, I think. We've gone a bit over. Let's go to the hour point and then reconnect soon after. Yulia, no. I'm not sure that you can operate effectively in the near future in the United States outside of the two main parties. That could change, but for the moment, you need to be the Republican or Democratic candidate to win. I know you're not talking about winning, you're talking about making a difference. No, I don't think I mean I think that could different things that happen could make an impact. But I think that if some Republicans try to put together a structure outside of the Republican Party, that would be highly unlikely to stop Trump winning if he's going to win, which he might not. Keely, thank you so much. What Lukashenko is trying to do on the Polish border, Lukashenko is playing a game where he is having to do various kinds of dances to um, impress the Kremlin. Underneath that, he is concerned about Wagner, um, and just like Putin has been recently concerned about the loss of monopoly of organized violence, um, Lukashenko is too, um, and maybe even more so. One brief observation about Trump: if Trump does win, um, let's not even mention the consequences of that for the climate, but um, Trump would be better this time round at organizing an elite around him. Last time he was a lone actor who basically, because of his personality issues, because of his neurodiversity and the way his neurodiversity interacted with his personality issues, his narcissism, his narcissistic disorder, he allegedly, right, he couldn't do the sort of thing that a Viktor Orban or a Putin in his place would have begun to do more effectively. Trump knows that he made this mistake. He will try to make it less next time round if he wins. But um, we cannot underestimate the strength of U.S. institutions. They're still strong. Jack, your question about Russians being the opposite of the Ubermensch, I'm not clear about. It doesn't sound like it's an avenue that's going to land you in a inexplanatorily useful place. Might even land you in a racist place. What I would say is that there is a certain voicelessness that Russian people have. Um, and if you want a sort of a 5-minute mention of it, Google Vyacheslav Morozov on YouTube and see if you can find an English language interview with him. Um, he's is he still at the University of Tartu? Let's have a look. Yep. Franklin is asking um, interesting questions. Um, letters of marque and reprisal were used to privatize war making in the past. Could you essentially give private citizens license to engage in piracy? Could Ukraine do this against Russia? Um, I'm not sure that's a question for me, um, but Ukraine needs to use its military. Um, what Ukraine has done effectively is presumably use various people on Russian soil to engage in activities. And that's quite available for Ukraine because of the deep interpenetration of Russian and Ukrainian societies, right? If you are a Russian, you're going to know a lot of Ukrainians, but if you're a Ukrainian, you're going to know a lot of Russians, a lot of Russians. And you could get them to do stuff. Or you could know Ukrainians who think of themselves as Ukrainian, partly who happen to be on Russian, living in Russia. I don't know. So the interpenetration is deep. That's what I'm trying to say. Um, and so you could get lots of people to act on Russian territory. Um, and then the other limit on Ukraine's activities is obviously that it can't piss off the West too much. What the West is happy about is what Ukraine has been engaging in so far on Russian territory. How happy the West would be if it escalated, which it will escalate if Ukraine's counteroffensive is not as successful as we would like. It'll escalate because it's a lever available for Ukraine to pull. So it's an inadequate answer to your question. They've replaced, Billy is saying they've replaced the Soviet hammer and sickle. Yeah, does this type of revisionism, taking away Russian symbols, basically, does this type of revisionism help, hurt, or distract? It it has to be part of a cultural vision. It has to be part of an important cultural vision of how Ukraine negotiates um, through these journeys of um, decolonization, de-Russification, de-Sovietization. These journeys can't be a product of identity politics on Twitter. It has to be a product of a vision that is appropriate for the country, right? It cannot be a product of unconstructive discourse. So absolutely, it's correct to change some symbols, but there has to be a story there that makes sense truthfully for Ukrainians of where Ukraine has come from, what Ukraine is, and where it's going, and the specific ways in which it's not Russia. So let's take Paul's question, and then I'm going to have a little bit of a crash and then maybe do a bit of work on the main channel video. Oh, Paul is just saying thank you. Even if he's not so sanguine about Trump's chances of winning the next election. We're going to talk about what happens in 2024 in the United States. Of course, it's of huge importance to Ukraine. Meanwhile, I am very grateful to you all. Quick question on West responsibility. Yes, I mean, we have some responsibility. And to understand that, we got to go back and say we don't just want to return to a pre-24 Feb order. We want to do something better than that. Pre-Feb 2022 world order. We're going to do something better than that. So, and we'll talk about that too. Anyway, everybody, thank you so much for being with me today. Yeah, open to any kind of collaborations in principle on YouTube. Thank you so much, everybody. Lots and lots of love. And bye-bye. Talk very, very soon. Ciao for now.